welcome to the 2022 Texas Tribune Festival. We're happy you're here, and a reminder that good manners and good behavior makes for a good fest for all. These are polarized times, so please be respectful and civil. Even when you see someone or hear something you don't like, enjoy the show.
Hello. Good evening. So nice to see all of you. I'm Evan Smith, the CEO and co-founder of the Texas Tribune. I could not be happier to welcome you back to the Texas Tribune Festival. We were last together on this stage 3 years ago. Seems like 300 years ago. Who knew what would happen between now and then? Public health emergency that took the lives of more than 1 million Americans, a violent insurrection at the U.S. Capitol, a campaign of lies about a stolen election, the overturning of Roe versus Wade, an FBI raid on the home of the former president, and that's just the biggest stuff. I feel like I say it over and over. The fire hose of news is turned up to the highest setting at all times these days, and nowhere more than in Texas. In that same 3 years, 90,000 of our friends and neighbors across the state succumbed to the pandemic. We had the collapse of our electric grid, an overhaul of our election laws, a loosening of our access to handguns, a gleeful pitting of city and county officials against state leaders on issues ranging from taxes to masks, headline-making fights over what books can and can't be on library shelves, what history can and can't be taught in schools, which students can and can't play school sports. And now the shipping off of migrants crossing our border to blue cities and blue states as an epic troll against the feds. Aren't you glad you've had a reliable, credible, independent source of news during that time? Our job at the Texas Tribune is to enable thoughtful and productive citizenship, to raise the level of civic engagement, and to civilize conversations about issues and ideas through our public service journalism, through our beat reporting, our daily and breaking news reporting, our political reporting, our watchdog and investigative reporting, our multimedia and data reporting, and editorial events like this one. Every day at the Tribune, we search for the truth and we tell you what we find. Every day, we hold public officials and taxpayer-funded institutions accountable without regard to party or ideology. Every day, we surface for all of you, yes, a hand for accountability, that's great. Every day, we surface for all of you in your busy lives things important enough for you to stop and pay attention to. That's what we said we would do 13 years ago when we launched, and it is still what we do, with ambition, energy, and purpose on platforms and stages large and small, but none larger than this. This is the 12th annual Texas Tribune Festival. The first 9, you may remember, were in person. The first 7 of those on the University of Texas campus until we outgrew them or they outgrew us. I don't remember which. The 8th and 9th were right here in downtown Austin. We had big plans for numbers 10 and 11, but COVID had even bigger plans for us. Our return to something that looks and feels like normal in year 12 is overdue and welcome. This festival just keeps getting better. More than 350 speakers this year and more than 120 hour-long sessions over 3 days, all of them carefully curated in perfect alignment with our mission. That's what we have in store for you, along with a few surprises. There's nothing we like doing more than putting thousands of people in dozens of rooms and having serious conversations about the future of Texas and the future of our country. An event like this does not happen without a lot of hands on the wheel and a lot of help. First, I want to thank the sponsors of this year's festival for stepping up and supporting our public interest journalism year-round. Their dollars enable everything that we do. Now I'm going to move into the mode of the guy at the end of the drug commercial reading all the agate type quickly. Arnold Ventures, the American Journalism Project, Curative DoorDash, Methodist Healthcare Ministries of South Texas, PepsiCo, Punchbowl News, Raise Your Hand Texas, 6th Street, the Sumners Foundation, Texas Monthly, Walmart, Baylor University, Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Texas, the Cynthia and George Mitchell Foundation, Frito-Lay North America, HCA Healthcare, the Lowy Law Firm, the Meadows Mental Health Policy Institute, Panacea Collective, Quest Diagnostics, Sands Corporation, Texas 2036, Texas A&M University, the Texas Managed Care Alliance, Texas Women's University, the University of Arizona, the UT School of Public Health, Visit Fort Worth, AARP Texas, Anheuser-Busch, the Austin Community College District, Barron, Adler, Clough, and Odo, the Beer Alliance of Texas, the Catania Foundation, Centerpoint Energy, Chevron, the Commit Partnership, Educate Texas, the Energy Foundation, the Global Alzheimer's Platform Foundation, HEB, the Hackett Center, the Hobby School of Public Affairs at the University of Houston, Hotel Magdalena, Jackson Walker LLP, JP Morgan Chase, Neuro, Encore, the Paso del Norte Center, Pastors for Texas Children, Pescador Public Strategies, Philanthropy Advocates, the RISA Foundation, Rice Master Social Policy Evaluation, St. David's Healthcare, Supermajority, the Texas Advanced Energy Business Alliance, the Texas Association of Community Colleges, the Texas Biomedical Research Institute, the Texas Cultural Trust, Texas Realtors, Texas Rural Funders, Tito's Handmade Vodka, always gets the biggest hand, the Trellis, I know why, the Trellis Foundation, University of Texas Press, and WGU Texas. Give them a hand. Every one of them supporting real journalism. I also want to thank our festival media partners, CBS News, the Austin American-Statesman, the Austin Chronicle, Austin PBS, Austin Vita, CityCast.fm, the Dallas Morning News, the Financial Times, KERA, KPRC, KSAT, KVUE, ProPublica, Ricochet, Texas Standard, the 19th WFAA, and Vox Media. Give them a hand, too, please. All right. Thank you to everybody on the Texas Tribune staff, too many to name, who worked to make this our best festival ever. Thanks to our outside partners, especially Agnes Farnham, Tanya Erlock, Autumn Rich, and everybody at Panacea, Rob Bustweiler, and everybody at Sunshine Sachs for their hard work and good cheer. And biggest and most sincere thanks to all of you for being here, for reading, for helping us carry the flag for a more informed, more engaged Texas, for giving us momentum and motivation. We love you for it. Your support makes everything we do possible. If you're already a member of the Texas Tribune, bless you. If you're not, consider signing up during our fall member drive, which ends this Sunday. Go to texastribune.org, texastribune.org/join to give during TribFest. And in addition to feeling great about making Texas better by making Texas smarter, you'll be entered to win one of 2 swanky weekend getaways. There's always a motivation to give. Here is the drill for tonight. About 50 minutes of back and forth on stage between the secretary and me, and then we'll do about 15 minutes of audience Q&A. We do not have microphones in the room here at the Paramount. Instead, as we've done at previous festivals, we're going to have you submit questions, and one of my Tribune colleagues will ask them on your behalf. Text your questions to 512-522-4676 at any time during this session. 512-522-4676. Don't worry about remembering the phone number. We will display it again later in the hour. Last things, speaking of phones, please silence yours. And if you're tweeting about this session or any other, use hashtag TribFest22. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our opening night keynote, a conversation with the United States Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, who a week ago I was convinced would be spending tonight not here with us, but at the bargaining table with railroad companies and workers. It's what happens a week before the festival. You get worried. Are they really going to come? Stuff happens. You text their people. They text back, it's going to be okay. Even without the threat of a strike that would have crippled travel and the economy, no cabinet department has been more consistently in the news in the first 2 years of the Biden administration than his. Transportation Secretary isn't the highest profile gig in most administrations, but Buttigieg made it the center of the action. He was instrumental to the passage last year of a historic $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill that won bipartisan support in the House and Senate. Let me say that again. Bipartisan support. That is something of a magic trick these days. Formerly called the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, it promised to rebuild the nation's roads, bridges, and rails, expand access to clean drinking water, ensure every American can get high-speed internet, tackle the climate crisis, advance environmental justice, create hundreds of thousands of jobs, and grow the economy. After 4 years of being promised that Infrastructure Week was coming, it finally arrived. And apparently, it's never going to end. Since the bill was signed into law, Secretary Buttigieg has been constantly in motion, promoting it, encouraging state and local officials to take advantage of it, and rebutting the criticism of it. While some who voted against it, including every Texan in Congress who is a Republican, while some who voted against it framed it as garden variety, exorbitant Washington spending, the Secretary described it to the annual meeting of the Transportation Research Board in January as investments that are going to have a real impact on daily lives. In April, he told Anderson Cooper, for pretty much as long as I've been alive, our country has been under-investing in public things. You get what you pay for. This is the Secretary's fourth appearance at TribFest. His first, I had forgotten about this one, honestly, until Liz Smith shamed me on Twitter, was in 2017, when he was the least well-known of 4 mayors on a panel about cities and climate change. He returned the next 2 years as a standalone interviewee. Each time he was better known and buzzier, a good get. It helped that he liked coming to Austin, whose mayor, Steve Adler, is an old running buddy of his and used to be the Texas Tribune's board chair. Friends in high places, yada, yada. The Secretary may not remember this, but we actually met early in 2017 when he was vying to be chair of the Democratic National Committee. There were 4 candidate forums around the country, and I moderated the one in Houston at Texas Southern University on a Saturday afternoon in late January. In a field of 11 candidates that included Tom Perez, who got the job, and Jamie Harrison, who has it now, the most interesting guy to me was a charming enough person I'd never heard of and whose name I kept stumbling over. Fortunately, Dave Weigel of the Washington Post pulled me aside beforehand and taught me to pronounce his name not as it read, Buttigieg, but phonetically. Dave literally stood there with me and said, boot, edge, edge. Boot, edge, edge. Pete Buttigieg was born and raised in South Bend, Indiana. His father immigrated to the U.S. from Malta. His mother was a 5th-generation Hoosier. He graduated from Harvard, where he studied history and literature, and was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford. In the 15 years since, and that's all it's been, he's 40. He's 40. He worked as a consultant at McKinsey & Company, was an intelligence officer in the U.S. Navy Reserve, and was deployed to Afghanistan. Unsuccessfully ran for Indiana State Treasurer, successfully ran to be mayor of his hometown, serving 2 4-year terms. In 2019, Mayor Pete, as we came to know him, launched his campaign for the Democratic nomination for president, and he struck a chord. He was young, articulate, charismatic, and moderate, temperamentally if not politically. You may have forgotten, 'cause I did. He won the Iowa caucus. I totally forgot that. But within 2 months, Joe Biden was the last of a couple dozen primary candidates standing. Following general election, the president-elect named Buttigieg to lead the Department of Transportation. He would go on to make history as the first openly gay member of a cabinet confirmed by the U.S. Senate. We are so lucky to have him here. Please join me in welcoming our opening night keynoter, Secretary Pete Buttigieg. Thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
Great. Mr. Secretary, thank you so much. It's great to have you back.
Thanks for having me. It is a bigger room than that first time.
It is. Although, you know, it occurred to me you had actually been in this very chair on this very stage the last 2 times, so it should look familiar to you. Right. I thought we'd start by talking about, I don't know, infrastructure.
Sounds
right?
good.
The impact. I want to talk about the impact specifically of your signature achievement, of the administration's significant achievement on that subject here in Texas, how the bill is going to solve all of our problems. Right? Setting expectations high, Mr. Secretary. You know there were 29.5 million residents of this state, officially, unofficially 30 million, thank you, census undercount, and we will grow to 47 million by 2050. We can't move the population we have today, let alone what's coming, right? High level, big picture, what will the investment do to address that basic problem, getting people from place to place?
Well, first of all, if you'll permit me an earnest moment, thank you for having me, and congratulations on everything you and the Texas Tribune have achieved in your tenure. I'm really glad to be here.
Thank you so much.
So on to my favorite subject.
Yeah.
So 2 things. We're going to do more, and we're going to work smarter. So first of all, the more part. Look, it's not just the last 4 years before this administration that there were a lot of promises about infrastructure without result. I would argue it's 40 years, my whole lifetime, that we have underinvested in American infrastructure. And that's why it's so important that we're now undertaking an investment that really looks at the big picture of infrastructure. It's not just a highway bill or just an airports bill. We're doing it all. Roads, highways and bridges, trains and transit, airports and ports. And we're making sure that we invest in ways that not just make up for lost time, but anticipate the kinds of needs that you have in places like Austin, where you have a good problem to have, which is extraordinary growth, but nevertheless, one that poses real challenges. But the second thing is we got to work smarter. We can't build tomorrow's roads and tomorrow's transportation on yesterday's principles.
Yeah.
So we're investing in ways to create better alternatives, to recognize the importance of active transportation. That yes, we are car people as a country. Cars will always play an important role in our lives, but you should not have to bring 2 tons of metal with you everywhere you're going just in order to be able to get somewhere.
Yeah.
It's safe and easy to walk, safe and easy to bike. You got to have good transit.
Yeah.
And as this city, under Mayor Adler's leadership and many others, even in quite conservative places have demonstrated, citizens are ready to vote to fund good transit because they understand the needs. But we need to make sure we meet that with federal leadership and federal resources. That's what we're doing with the funds in this bill.
So let's talk about that specifically, and let's talk about Texas, of course, specifically, because that'll be of interest to everybody here. You helpfully put out a fact sheet for each state last November, adding up the anticipated spend on each of the key priorities in the bill. And I want to talk about some of that stuff if you don't mind. So roads and bridges are the obvious one. That's what people think of first when they think about what you all do. In Texas, there are more than 800 bridges, more than 19,000 miles of highway in poor condition. Since 2011, commute times have increased by more than 11%. The average driver is paying about $700 a year because they're driving on roads that need repair. We are getting through this bill an estimated $27 billion for highway repairs, $537 million for bridges over 5 years. So how does that work exactly? Are you just dropping a cartoon bag of money with a dollar sign on it? How, like as a mechanism for that money showing up in our roads and in our bridges? How's that work?
Well, and that's just the formula part.
Right.
There's another side that I'll talk about in a moment.
Yeah.
But the way that works is that we partner with the states, and there's a formula set by Congress on how that funding is distributed based on the need, based on the assets that you have that need work. Then you have the discretionary side. So over and above that, there are also opportunities for communities to come directly to us, to the department. Matter of fact, we just signed off on a couple of rounds of grants that include everything from $40 million going to George Bush Intercontinental Airport to funding for inspection facilities at the border crossing in McAllen. So those are designed for things that haven't made it through the kind of plumbing and the machinery of the state departments of transportation, but we still think are worthwhile. But importantly, whether we're talking about the formula dollars or whether we're talking about the discretionary funds that we have for roads, supply chains, you name it, we're not thinking up the project. I'm not sitting there with a napkin, or for that matter, with a staff, conceiving projects and then foisting them on communities. Our philosophy, the philosophy of this program is the ideas don't all have to come from Washington,
Right.
but more of the funding should. So communities can come to us, states can come to us,
Yeah.
and we'll provide the funding for as many projects as we can when the projects align with our goals of enhancing safety, driving economic growth,
Right.
helping us confront the climate crisis, delivering more equity in transportation in the past, and preparing for the future.
So the way that money will show up in my life and in the lives of people here is there is a process in which communities will come to you all and say, we want to do X, Y, Z.
Yes.
And those projects will be approved or not approved, and there'll be a mechanism for that money getting back. I mean, it's pretty much what you would expect.
I think so. Yeah. That's what you would hope for.
Not complicated. So on the public, you define infrastructure broadly, so I want to talk about some of the things that might not immediately come to mind. Public transportation seems to me an obvious thing within this. You all said, which I thought was quite interesting, Texans who take public transit spend nearly 81% more time commuting than they otherwise would, given the options currently available. And it's a particular problem for people of color who are nearly 3 times more likely to take the bus or the train to work. There's an equity piece to this, as you said. So we're getting $3 billion over 5 years, again, formula, to improve public transportation options statewide. Practically speaking, that means the same thing. Come to us with proposals. Right?
And there's formula dollars too through the federal transit.
Over and above.
So again, it's really trying to meet communities where they are. And when you have a community, and again, Austin is just one example of community that, and I recently saw the work going on in Houston, that has decided to put its own resources up. We can meet that with federal support too, and they can amplify and multiply.
Is it necessarily a match? Do we have to do something before you do something?
Typically, yes, but it depends on the program. So, for example, on bridges, we found that in a lot of rural areas, even funding 20% of a project, and we do the other 80, which is the traditional pattern there, that 20% might not seem a lot, but it was prohibitive for some of these smaller, lower-resourced rural communities. So we're going to pick up 100 on some of those. So we're trying to be as flexible as we can. We're trying to be a good partner, but we can always be a better partner when a city or a state chooses to bring a lot of resources to the table.
So in the case of roads and bridges, Mr. Secretary, and public transit, no matter what state you're in, everybody loves that stuff. I'm not sure that the attitude or the appetite for electric vehicles is necessarily the same every place. And that's another big part of what you've got funded here, $408 million to Texas over 5 years to expand the electric vehicle charging network. There's another $2.5 billion in grant funding dedicated to charging that we can apply for a portion of. You know what Texas will say about this? You're coming to take our gas, right?
We're coming to save you money and help the climate. In fact, once, not early in my tenure, I was testifying in Congress, and a member of Congress from Texas said, all this EV stuff doesn't really do much for where I'm from. I'm from a district in Texas with a lot of big, wide open roads. People drive long distances. They don't have any use for these electric vehicles. They're interested in things like pickup trucks. And for a sec, I thought, am I being set up? But I wasn't. And so I leaned in and I said, well, let me tell you about electric pickup trucks. Some of the best use cases for electric vehicles are in places like Texas. Places where people spend more time in their vehicles, where you drive longer distances than in a dense coastal city. And therefore spend more money on gas, and therefore would save more money, provided you can afford an electric vehicle, which is why we're fighting to make electric vehicles cheaper, which is why it's a little bit ironic when some of the same Republican members of Congress who voted against making EVs cheaper attack them for being too expensive. But the bill passed, so we're happy anyway. And in rural areas, you have a higher proportion of people living in single-family homes. Remember, it's considerably easier to solve the charging puzzle if you have the benefit of living in a single-family home. You just plug it into your garage. So even though I get that electric vehicles, because of how they entered our consciousness and entered the market, they kind of code culturally as a coastal...
More of a California thing than a Texas.
Yeah, you're sipping your latte on your way to pick up your sushi or whatever they think people in West Coast cities...
Is that what California is like? Wow, tell me more.
No, I mean, that's the cartoon version that seems to be out there.
It is.
But last week, I was at the Detroit Auto Show with the president, and the stuff that is being produced.
They're coming up with great stuff, right?
These vehicles are incredible. They floored in one of the pickup trucks. They hit the floor. It's amazing.
Yeah.
And it is amazingly relevant for the lives of people in places
So
like
that's a big priority, which I hear, and thank you for the explanation on that. Let me ask you about broadband. This has been the epicenter, I think, among the 50 states of a very significant broadband conversation over the last couple of years, in part because we knew that this was a problem before the pandemic. We really saw it during the pandemic in Texas. 14% of Texas households aren't on the internet. 4% of Texans live in areas without any broadband infrastructure at all. In rural communities, nearly 1/3 of residents, 1 million of our fellow Texans, don't have internet access or speeds adequate to remote learning, telemedicine, or e-commerce. This bill gives us at least $100 million to expand broadband coverage. It gives about 8.5 million Texans, almost 30% of the population, eligibility for the low-income affordability connectivity benefit. We have just now finally created a state broadband office, like we're getting our acts together on this a little bit late. How is this in your construct in infrastructure? I mean, I think, again, people are like, well, is he in his lane or is he out of his lane?
Yeah.
Explain how you thought about this.
I think it's essential infrastructure. It's a little out of my lane in the sense that Secretary Raimondo and the Commerce Department have the lead on implementing this part of the infrastructure bill, but I don't hesitate to make the case for it, because I think it's obvious that today having an internet connection is as essential as having a connection to the interstate highway system. You could even argue that if you really want an equivalency, it's kind of like what was happening in the pre-World War II area with electrification, which people in many places couldn't imagine living without and took for granted, and in other parts of America, especially rural America, still lived without.
Yeah.
That's really what it's like. Except, as you mentioned, there's got to be available, and it's got to be affordable. And that's exactly what this infrastructure law is doing, a vision of making sure that 100% of Americans can get online and can afford to get online. And the pandemic has, I think, escalated our awareness of how important it is. In my hometown, we were hearing stories of parents who would take their kids and park the car in the parking lot of a McDonald's so that they could pick up the Wi-Fi so that they could go to school.
Wow.
And that's no way to run a country.
Well, as you know, in a state like Texas, the best argument is often one to make about the economy, right? This is going to have an economic benefit. Texas 2036 says that the result of people not having sufficient access is a $5 billion loss to the economy.
Of course.
That if we don't give people access, we're leaving a whole bunch of money on the table, and maybe that's the argument that we have to make.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of investments we can't afford not to make. It's like the leaky roof. You're not saving money letting the leaky roof get worse. And that's true with what we call the pothole tax that you mentioned, of leaving a road in bad shape and your car gets beat up. And it's certainly true, the things we miss out on, but not just generically as an economy. But think about the individual child who misses out on their potential because they can't access the internet and everybody around them can. Right? It is a matter of justice as well as a matter of economic development.
So, Mr. Secretary, as you know, extreme weather in Texas is a thing. We have experienced this. There were 67 extreme weather events from 2010 to 2020 in Texas, $200 billion in damages, and that's up to 2020. Then we had the grid collapse in 2021, where we had almost $200 billion in damages right there associated with that. We're going to get $53 million over 5 years for wildfire protection. And then there's apparently a $3.5 billion national investment in weatherization. Of course, because of the grid collapse, this jumped out at me. Is this weatherization of power plants and gas facilities, or is this more consumer weatherization of homes?
So one of the most exciting things about the most recent legislation to pass is it will make it more affordable to do clean energy retrofits in homes.
In homes?
Yes.
So it's consumer focused?
Yes, or at least that part of it is.
Yeah.
And I think there are elements of the infrastructure law that help here too, although I'm less involved in the direct energy related pieces of it. But look, the fundamental situation we're in is one where not only do we need to do everything we can to fight climate change and stop it from being any worse than it already is, hence the EV investments, making sure transit is available, working towards sustainable aviation fuels, and that's just talking about some of the transportation-related things
Right.
to fight climate change. But it's also, it's here. It's here and we have to deal with it. And if a road is getting washed out,
Right.
and you replace it just the way it was, and then it gets washed out again the next year, and you replace it just the way it was,
Right.
and then it gets washed out the next year, let's do something besides, let's move it uphill or something different. And that's, we have about $7 billion in a new, first of its kind program called Protect, which is about supporting resilience efforts in different communities that are
Yeah.
already contending with whether it's a mudslide or a wildfire, in Northwest, Pacific Northwest, cables at risk of melting. They had to shut down the transit system during heat waves that aren't even supposed to be statistically possible. And as you've said, pointed out, whether it's the grid or flooding or other issues that have happened here in Texas, every state in the union has something on the line when it comes to these resilience issues, evacuation routes, you name it. We're going to be funding that on the transportation side, thanks to what's in that law.
Now, this aspect of it, I wonder, as the criticism from around the country has come in the aftermath of this bill, well, in fact, when the bill was getting voted on, the response to this portion was something on the order of subject, verb, Green New Deal, right? That what you heard was, well, this is really out of your lane, and you're also doing something that we're not sure, you would be better off just not even touching this part of it. Don't worry about the weather or the climate piece.
Right.
Just stick with roads and bridges.
Right.
Yeah.
As if roads have nothing to do with
Right.
weather, with
This is all
soil.
this is all of a piece, is the point.
I mean, you ought to see, I was in Colorado. We looked at I-70, where you had wildfires followed by floods, which
Right.
led to mudslides, which you want to talk about supply chain problems.
Right.
There's not a lot of alternatives when you're going through that canyon to I-70, and it was out of commission for more than a week.
Right.
Brilliant, heroic efforts by engineers and transportation officials there to bring it back online. But of course, there's a relationship.
This
not
is
only,
about roads, yeah.
Not only that, if you look at the economy, the single sector that contributes the most emissions is transportation. And that's just talking about the vehicles, trains, planes, and automobiles. That's not even counting the materials that we use. And that doesn't just have to be a story about what's gone wrong. There's a very exciting story about what could go right. I was with the new White House climate advisor in Ohio looking at where they have, to naked eye it might look like an ordinary steel facility, but they have a different technology, a different technique, and it dramatically reduces the life cycle emissions of these pellets of iron that then go into the arc furnace for making steel. Concrete, there are forms of concrete now being conceived that are actually carbon negative. There's less carbon in the air because they were made.
So you've convinced me this is of a piece.
I think so, literally, physically, concretely.
So let me add. That's a pretty good dad joke, Secretary.
Really trying to lean into the dad thing now.
I want to ask about two more quick aspects of this that interest me, and then I have a question about something that's not in this.
Yeah.
So clean drinking water, you may know that we just had a thing in Odessa, Texas. 165,000 people without water for 48 hours after an aging line broke, and then you had what happened in Jackson, Mississippi, which overwhelmed any discussion anywhere of that.
Yeah.
This is obviously a problem.
Yeah.
We're getting almost $3 billion over 5 years to improve water infrastructure.
Yeah.
Again, how'd you arrive at this as a priority in the bill?
Mostly because you need water to live.
Straightforward. Straightforward.
Right?
Yeah.
And I think every mayor thinks a lot about this.
Yeah.
Because it's one of those things that if it's going all right, you don't think about it. And if it's not going all right, you don't have the luxury of thinking about anything else. If you're one of those parents, if you're in Odessa, if you're in Jackson, Mississippi right now, if you're in Flint or a lot of other places, you don't even have the freedom to fully concentrate on whatever is most meaningful in your life.
Yeah.
Raising your children, living in accordance with your faith, starting a business, whatever it is. Because you have to worry about whether a glass of clean, safe drinking water is going to come out of the tap that isn't going to poison your family. The whole idea of infrastructure. I remember seeing one elected official from the other party during the debate over the infrastructure bill saying, well, a bunch of stuff isn't even infrastructure, like these pipes for water. What's that about? Infra literally means under, right? It's the things that are under our structures that make everything else possible, metaphorically and physically.
Yeah.
And what could be more fundamentally important beneath all of the structures we count on, again, metaphorically and physically, than the ones that deliver and remove water?
All right, so you mentioned airports, Mr. Secretary, earlier. We're getting a little bit more than $1 billion, again, over 5 years for infrastructure development. Now, let me be clear. I understand why that's important. You're not talking about the stuff you're doing with airlines.
Right.
It's airports. But I want to go to the airline stuff, because after years and years of us all being at the mercy of the airlines, flights being late, flights being canceled, all of us feeling like we don't matter, you've actually decided to step up and do something about it. I want you to say a word about that.
Yeah. So first of all, if you've had that experience, especially this summer, being canceled or delayed, I want you to know I'm right there with you. We saw some really problematic trends in numbers after the Memorial Day travel day weekend,
Right.
Travel holiday. I convened a meeting of all of the CEOs of the airlines to talk about this problem. And the next morning, I got up, I checked my phone, and my flight was canceled.
They made the wrong guy mad. That's what I'm thinking.
This is a little bit on the nose.
Right.
So a lot of us have felt this frustration. And it's more than that. Look, sometimes there's a storm, there's a problem that couldn't be avoided. Occasionally that'll happen. But it was not only happening more than it should, but when it did happen, people were told there were 6, 8, 9, 12-hour waits to get somebody on the phone to deal with it. They weren't getting their refunds. So one step that we took this summer was we realized that all the airlines have to file a customer service plan with us. If you've never seen one of these customer service plans, that's because it's typically buried on a website somewhere. It's this PDF. It's unintelligible anyway. It doesn't tell you much. The point of that rule, of course, is that they got to clarify how they're going to treat customers beyond the legal minimum. I'll talk about the legal minimum in a minute. And we were frustrated with that. So we got with the team and said, what can we do about this? And so how about we just make a really clear tool online, red X's or green check marks, airline by airline for the top 10 airlines, of whether they'll actually book you on another flight if you get stuck, book you on another airline's flight if you get stuck, take care of your meal if you're canceled or delayed and it's their fault.
Yeah.
Get you a hotel. And we announced we were going to do this. It was a pretty simple website, so it didn't take but a few days. And I wrote a letter and said, so we're going to put this up in 2 weeks. This week would be a great time for you to clear up and raise the bar on your policies. And sure enough, we went from 0 airlines out of the top 10 that commit in writing that they're going to offer you, for example, a meal voucher when you get stuck, to 9 out of the top 10, just in those 2 weeks.
Right. Can you, who was the 10th?
I'll let you go to the website and find out for yourself.
Does it rhyme with Spirit Airlines? What you can't tell us the 10th?
I'll let you go to the website.
All right.
Because who knows, maybe since I got here, they updated their
Well, I want to say, Mr. Secretary, I heard from someone on your flight today from Washington that you landed 20 minutes early. And I heard that and I thought, very smart. Don't piss him off tonight.
I guess if we're gonna get blamed for stuff we didn't do, we might as well get credit for that.
All right. So, Mr. Secretary, where is the allocation for rail? I saw the fact sheet that you sent around. Not a word mentioned about rail. You know we've been having a conversation about high-speed rail in Texas for years.
Yeah.
And among the biggest holdups has been how we're going to pay for it. This was going to be privately funded, the last effort to do this. But there's always been a desire to get federal funds in the mix. And I know California has had its own stop and start on high-speed rail. Why are you not helping us get from point to point faster by rail?
So we are big believers in passenger rail.
Right.
And projects here in Texas are eligible.
Right.
We have the main program for this is called the Fed-State Partnership. And there are other resources that could kick in too. Now, the rail vision you're talking about, that high-speed Dallas to Houston, is privately organized, but there are some ways that even private efforts can get federal support. So I don't want to prejudice any possible applications or proposals that may come in or not come in. But I'll say this. I think Texas is a great place to demonstrate the high-speed rail. People keep saying, you know, right? I mean, maybe you might even want to compete a little bit with another state on who can do it better and faster and who can do it first. Any place where you have large metropolitan areas that are within a couple hours train ride, or at least a couple hours fast train ride with each other, a lot of economic activity, are very good places for this. And look, ordinarily I'd be the in most rooms, I think, the biggest passenger rail guy. Obviously, in this administration, I'm always going to be the second, at best.
Yeah,
the second
the big guy is a fan, is he not?
Oh, we had a meeting with him on some rail work that was going on, and he asked so many detailed questions down to the curve of a certain area he knew well that we had to organize another meeting and bring more experts. He is passionate about this, and we as an administration are, because it makes sense economically. It is part of the struggle against climate change. And I would just add, why should America not have the best passenger rail in the world?
So you're open. Should you get an overture from this state on that subject, you'll listen, and there's potentially money available for us?
Sure.
Right, okay. So I want to ask you whether this money comes with strings attached. That is always the question that Texas asks. When the federal government wants to give us money, are there strings attached? You may know that after the infrastructure bill passed, Governor Abbott sent a letter around to state agency heads warning them to think twice before taking any of the money that we just talked about. I'm going to read you a quote from the letter. Should the acceptance of any federal funds hinder or needlessly constrain the state, commit the state to ongoing costs, which there's not an appropriate appropriation available, or require an agency to implement a federal policy contrary to the law or policy of the state, this agreement proposed by the federal agency, your agency, should not be signed. So he's basically saying to everybody, watch out. If any strings come with this money, don't take it. Does Texas have anything to fear from you on this bill?
No. Unless they're planning on breaking a federal law. Look, of course.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's what I have in mind. So we have, for example, federal rights, civil rights legislation like Title VI that we enforce vigorously to make sure that if you have an infrastructure project, it cannot illegally discriminate against the community and make them worse off, right?
Right.
Of course we have that. And I would like to think, by the way, that part of being conservative is that you wouldn't want the federal government to be in the business of writing blank checks. So, of course, we have a lot of expectations around federal taxpayer money.
Right.
Eligibility, compliance, auditing, all kinds of things. But I don't think that's a reason not to do it. I think that's a reason to be proud when you successfully receive federal funds.
Right. Can you tell me what happens if we don't take the money? So I'm remembering a conversation around Medicaid expansion when the opportunity, as it's come up a couple times, has been put before this state, and this state has serially declined to take advantage of Medicaid expansion. And one argument made back to the state has been, you hate California so much, if you don't take the money, you're literally funding health care in California. Are we funding transportation in California if we don't take the money?
You could be. But I will also say there's some elements of, I think, very elegant policy design that the administration and Congress put in this infrastructure law on, because we've learned from things like 2009, under the Obama administration, when the stimulus contained a lot of resources for rail that would have been very beneficial in certain states whose governors decided they didn't care for trains and just passed on the money or sent it back to Washington. So take the electric vehicle charging funds that we are doing through the states to set up a charging network of EV chargers, because that's part of how we're going to make sure that it's convenient and easy to do.
Right.
One of the features that was written into this was if the state decides not to apply, then instead of penalizing the people who live in that state for their leaders' choices, it'll just revert to communities, mayors who might have some ideas on how to spend it.
So I was actually going to ask that question because, again, back on Medicaid expansion, when the state declined to take Medicaid money, the cities and the counties said, hey, can we take it?
Right.
And there was a question about whether that was a possibility. You're saying it is in this case.
Yeah, it's built in, and I think, but you know what's funny is not only, I think, does that make sense in that event to allow the communities to use it, but it also has a remarkable effect on your governors. We haven't seen anybody pass on that money on the EV charging thing.
So, looking back on this, Mr. Secretary, it occurs to me what an accomplishment it was to get this passed, given the complicated math in Congress. And the fact that the Democratic majority, the President's party, your party, is so narrow in the House. You lost 6 Democratic votes, squad votes, on this bill because they believed the bill was not progressive enough. But you got the votes of 13 Republicans. Even though no Texas Republicans voted for it, I will note they've been perfectly happy to brag back home about the money flowing into their districts. That's how this goes. So, and this was last year, right? So what's happened in the time since, Mr. Secretary? The president, who was back on his heels just a little while ago, now has got the CHIPS bill passed.
Yeah.
He got the Veterans Health Care bill passed. He just signed the Inflation Reduction Act.
That's right.
He's doing better. His approval rating is up.
The president's on a roll.
You think so?
It's a remarkable legislative run.
So my first question as it relates to that role is it enough? Can the dogs be held off in 6 weeks? You know the historical record when it comes to midterms. Everyone's expecting the Democrats to lose majority in the House, maybe in the Senate, maybe not, that it's going to be a bad election cycle, because it always is for the president's party in the midterm. Has enough happened in the last year to reverse that?
So if I'm sounding cautious here, it's only because I have to take care of hearing in this capacity, not to speak
This is
about
not to violate the
campaigns
Hatch
and
Act
elections.
Festival. I understand that. Yeah,
Thank you
it's
for
okay. I get
keeping
it.
me out of trouble.
Yeah.
But let me say this.
Yeah.
First of all, I believe good policy is good politics, and I believe every one of those things you just mentioned is good policy. Let me also reflect that a lot of the things that have just happened, certainly the infrastructure law, where we did attract some Republicans to cross over and work with Democrats to get it done. By the way, people scoffed at the president when he took office, saying that there was going to be this kind of bipartisan work.
Right.
And, you know...
Well, but Mr. Secretary, bipartisan in a lot of these cases is all of your guys and like a couple of their guys.
Okay, but we got a lot of senators.
Well, that's true. You did get more senators. Fair enough.
We didn't get yours, but we got two senators.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Fair enough. You meant the royal yours, didn't you? I'm sure.
But let me add this. You take the Inflation Reduction Act.
Right.
Okay, not one Republican voted for that.
Correct.
When you look at the things that are in there, $35 a month insulin for people on Medicare, because we wanted that for everybody, and the Republicans killed it.
Right.
But that letting Medicare actually negotiate prescription drug prices like everybody thinks they ought to,
Yep.
right? And cutting the deficit by a lot when you did that. Those are things that a very, very big majority of Americans, Republicans, Democrats, and independents believe ought to happen. So it's true, didn't get any Republican votes on Capitol Hill.
Right.
But in a deeper, richer, important sense, I would still describe it as a bipartisan policy, a bipartisan achievement.
Well, and in terms of the impact, it's going to affect everybody.
It's going to be, yeah, I mean, obviously nobody's going to check how you voted when you're getting those benefits in terms of your health care.
So I understand that you can't talk politics. I'm going to just ask a couple of questions in which you may tell me you should have heard me the first time. I can't talk about this stuff. What happens in the next 2 years if you don't hold off the dogs? These elections impact the ability of you and your fellow cabinet secretaries, cabinet departments to get anything else done in the next 2 years. We have seen this before when the House and the Senate or both flip. Everything grinds to a halt. So is that what we're potentially in for? If one or both houses flips, you got a Democratic president, you got Republican control of one or both houses, we basically say, see you in 2 years.
Look, my job is to work with whoever's in Congress,
Right.
and I will at least attempt to work with anybody in Congress in order to get things done. It is typically easier to work with people who are in Congress from your own party, but that's by no means the only way to get things done. But also, we're going to be implementing this law that got passed, and one of the things I've noticed is, to your earlier observation about credit, even the people who voted against this seem awful happy when we bring infrastructure funding to their district or their state.
Right.
So I think at least on the implementation front, we're going to have a lot of good work ahead.
Okay, this one you're going to hate from a Hatch Act standpoint, but I'm just warning you. So speaking of the first term, are all these wins going to curtail questions about 2024? President was asked about his plans on 60 Minutes, and he gave what I thought was a pretty inconclusive answer to Scott Pelley. This is what he said on Sunday. My intention is that I would run again, but it's just an intention. Is it a firm decision that I run again? That remains to be seen. What?
Well,
why is he hedging?
Well, look, you got to remember that when somebody states that they are running, that can be a legal trigger that sets off a whole set
So this
of...
was a technical answer?
I mean,
Am I to take it from that? Because I read that as a guy who literally has not decided whether he's running again.
I mean, the president speaks for himself.
Right.
But,
okay, you speak for you. You speak for you. Should he run again?
I'm excited. Again, you're going to get me into Hatch Act jail. So all I'll say is I'm really looking forward to continuing to serve under this president's leadership for as long as
he's in office. So you did You did fine with that, by the way. That was fine. I'm sorry, I got to ask. So you yourself have run, as I mentioned once before. Everybody remembers your campaign, right? Yes. And relative to expectations, you outkicked your coverage, as we like to say here in Texas.
I mean, expectations were not.
Well, this is the point.
I got in.
You were the mayor of a city of 100,000. To give people here a sense of what that's like the mayor of Tyler winning the Iowa caucus.
Could happen.
In fact, Tyler may be bigger than South Bend, actually. What did you learn about yourself, and what did you learn about the country during the campaign?
Oh, wow. Well, you learn a lot about yourself, obviously. I'm still chewing on some of the things I learned running for president. I mean, you learn about what matters. You learn about who you can count on, friends who are there for you, but also, of course, in the context of a relatively new marriage. You know, I'd been married to Chasten maybe a year, and all of that picked up. You learn just how important love is for getting you through an undertaking like that. The biggest and most beautiful thing I learned was that even though things were different, people were different, states were different, the issues were different, certain things are, you know, politics, of course, by its nature, is exquisitely human. And policy, if you're doing it right, is also very, very human. And what I found was that when you're running for president and somebody comes up to you to talk, they're usually going to bring you whatever's the most important thing in their life, or at least the most important thing in their life that they think might go differently or go better depending who's in the presidency. And people bring you stories of everything from the most heartbreaking stories of healthcare struggles and loss, the most amazing, uplifting accounts of how people have built lives against all of the odds. And you also see certain patterns that radically different people have in common, like the search for belonging, which is a big theme of our campaign.
Yeah.
And you began to see something in common between a guy in an auto town like where I grew up who takes such pride in being able to not just provide for a family, but have a role in a community that is inseparable from the manufacturing job that he's had for a long time. And now some people, including some well-intentioned folks, maybe from my side of the aisle, come along talking to him about retraining for some totally different career that might substitute his income but isn't going to substitute his sense of belonging. And a queer kid in high school who just wants to be on the kickball team. And also, in a very different way, looking for that very same sense of belonging and finding it threatened by policy choices. And realizing that sameness, I don't mean to be naive about the profound and terrifying differences that exist in this country, but seeing that kind of universality of it was an amazing, beautiful thing that I don't think, especially as an introvert who doesn't normally go around to strangers asking them what the most important thing in their life is, just opens, you just expand yourself to other people, and it's a beautiful thing.
This was something that I noticed on your campaign. You were the mayor of a blue city in a red state. How red? Mike Pence was your governor.
Pretty red.
For 4 years, and you somehow showed up having figured out how to talk to people in small C conservative communities in the middle of the country. And that's something we hear a lot about today as a need and a priority in Texas and also for the Democratic Party. And I wonder if you have advice for candidates on that. You know, here in Texas, Beto O'Rourke is running for governor and is spending a lot of time, again, as he did in the Senate race in 2018. He's spending a lot of time in rural communities. That is partly a math problem. Democrats have not cracked 25% in rural Texas in the last 4 elections. It is hard, if not impossible, to be competitive if you don't. But a theme of his campaign, at least this time, has been we all need to figure out the things that we have in common, right?
Yeah.
So this resonates for you. That was kind of the purpose of your time on the road, was to talk about the need for people to prioritize that.
Yeah, and just to talk to people, period. I mean, people sometimes, this is one of the reasons I go on Fox News.
Yeah, you're like the U.S. ambassador to Fox News right now.
Well, it's because I know there are a lot of people who are, I don't always find that especially the opinion hosts are broadcasting in good faith, but I know there are people who are tuning in good faith.
Yeah.
And how can I hold it against somebody for not considering supporting our administration's message if they've literally never heard it?
Right.
And don't we have a responsibility to make sure they do?
If you talk to them, if you talk to them, they may support you, they may not. If you don't
it's not like they're going to
talk to them, they won't.
It's not like they're going to hear me and magically decide we were right about everything and everybody else
Right.
heard it. It's not like that, but it's a conversation. And also, if you come at it the way you would approach a conversation with a family member who you care about, who you have seen do incredible things for their own loved ones, and would give you the shirt off their back in a second if you needed them, and would be there for you
right.
in the toughest of circumstances, and then they open their mouth about politics and what they say horrifies you, right? But you know that they're not just defined by that. Which, by the way, is the opposite of what it's like to encounter somebody on Twitter where all you know about them is what they see. Right? I'm talking about our best selves don't generally find their way onto social media.
Yeah.
Then you're having a conversation where it becomes possible to see each other as human beings first.
Right.
And that is unbelievably important. Remember, just talking about, I'm not even talking about kind of unity in a kind of mealy-mouthed kind of way. I'm talking about just for our country to move past some of the radicalization that exists, which, by the way, is not symmetrical. It is not the same on both sides. It's just not. But if you're on my side of the aisle and you want to live in a country where some of the things that we saw under the last administration are universally agreed to be beyond the pale, that means, by definition, that at some point in our future, people who were on board with it then will go on to be as horrified by it later as we were now. That doesn't just happen. And it definitely doesn't happen if you're not talking to me.
It takes work, yeah. We're going to go to audience questions here in a bit. Let's put the phone number, please, back up on the screen and keep it there. And remember to text in your questions for the secretary. My colleague, Darla Cameron, will come out momentarily, join us in the corner of the stage and ask. I want to, as our portion wraps here, I want to turn the conversation to you. Specifically. So I heard you talk to Kara Swisher at the Code Conference a couple of weeks ago. And I was really moved by the discussion when it turned personal, when the two of you, public figures who are part of the LGBTQ plus community, acknowledged the threat of the country, taking steps backward on laws material to your life and choices. Now, that day you were in California. Today you're in Texas. A state that has not gone out of its way, to say the least, to be friendly to the LGBTQ plus community. Both of our U.S. senators say they will vote against a congressional bill to codify same-sex marriage, your marriage, right? If and when one comes up. The governor of our state has initiated investigations of the families of trans kids. It wasn't long ago that every legislative session we had a fight over how to keep same-sex couples from adopting foster kids, which you just did with your husband this time last year. How do you think about the world we're in and the moment we're in as it affects you and yours personally on these issues?
Well, first of all, I have an incredible family. As you mentioned, Chasten and I adopted newborn infants just over a year ago.
Yeah.
A boy and a girl. They've turned our world upside down, and it's the most amazing thing. And it's puzzling to me that anybody would want to tear that up. I've met both of your senators and your governor. I don't know their spouses. I don't know anything about their marriages. But I cannot imagine a situation where I would attempt to undo one of their marriages. So what makes them think that they are fit to pronounce upon mine? And it's just, we finally got there as a country. We finally got there. And if you put it into a bigger picture, to me, the most remarkable thing about America, the best thing about America, is that every generation, more or less, has gone on to see greater rights and freedoms than the generation before. It's not been a straight line, it's been a zigzag.
Right.
But if you look at the sweep of history, it has moved in this country in a very clear direction toward more rights, more freedoms.
Yep.
Freedoms that have changed my life. Sitting next to you as a married man and a war veteran who can talk about his husband and kids would have been, and be in this job that I'm in, would have been preposterous just 10 years ago. So I've personally benefited from that. And the question now for all of us living in America in these times is,
Right.
did we just live to see the high watermark of rights and freedoms? I mean, we've got the Dobbs decision, which obviously does not affect me in the way that it affects the millions and millions of women who have had their right to choose taken away, but it affects everybody. You have our right to be married coming up for debate again. You have a governor who, I mean, one minute they're talking about parents' rights, and next thing you know, they're attacking parents who, when confronted with that sometimes disorienting and sometimes even threatening situation of your kid coming out to you as being in an incredibly vulnerable position, try to do the right thing for your kid, and then a government official wants to come and investigate you for trying to take care of your kid. They're talking about banning books. They are banning books.
Well, in fact, we found out from PEN America this week that Texas has banned more books than any state in the country.
What a thing, of all the things for Texas to be in the lead in, so we got to decide.
Yeah.
Are we going to be the generations of Americans who live to see the high watermark of rights and freedoms in the United States of America, or are we going to see to it that expansion, that great American story of expanding rights and freedoms continues on our watch?
Mr. Secretary, Darla Cameron. Darla, Mr. Secretary. Yeah. My colleague, Darla Cameron, is now going to ask some questions submitted by many of you in the audience. Darla, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much.
First question, please.
First question. Should highways be expanded through Texas's cities when communities and local governments expose the expansion, but state transportation departments like TxDOT insist on funding these projects?
So, this is, again, among other things, where our responsibilities come into play. Look, the system, love it or hate it, the system gives the states a lot of leeway to make decisions with the funding that comes into things like road and bridge repair and expansion and design. And I think in the case, actually in the case of the EV chargers, I'm excited about that because this is new territory and we don't know what some of the states are going to come up with.
Right.
When it comes to
Right.
when it comes to some of the other things that are going on, part of what we're doing with Title VI is making sure that the law is upheld and the communities are heard. And a lot of our responsibilities and our powers are procedural to make sure that communities are not trampled in this process.
Right.
So we're going to respect the lawful role of the states, but we are watching very closely to make sure that those responsibilities are upheld. And in some cases, an example of how that can happen is if a highway project does, in fact, with disparate impact, trample a community's rights. And we have we have an office that is going to vigorously enforce any violations on that front.
Great. Darla, another question.
Yeah. Several attendees have expressed their concerns about the environmental impact of the proposed Seaport Oil Terminal in Freeport. Have you visited the area and where do you stand on the project?
So I haven't been to Freeport, but I am familiar with the project. I've heard a lot about it, including on my last visit to Austin, and I know a lot of folks here are very concerned with that too. It went out for public comment. We received thousands of comments on that, and now we're in a stage where I can't comment much because of where it sits in the legal process. But what I will say is that we're going to take all of that input very seriously. And that any outcome is going to be one that upholds the law, same as the last one we talked about,
Yeah.
and is responsive to all of the things that are required of us as a department. And that part of how our system works is to gather that input.
You're listening. That's the
And
point. You're listening.
I hear you.
Yeah. Okay. Yes.
All right. How is an electric vehicle system resilient to power grid collapse, either from weather, like we've experienced in Texas, or from cyber attacks?
Yeah. So actually, one feature that folks don't know enough about on some of these electric vehicles, especially the pickup trucks, is they actually can reverse the charge. In other words, it can work almost like a generator. So there is a world, we're not there yet, because we're actually still working to make sure the grid can keep up with a rollout of more electric vehicles. But that's happening. That grid work is happening too. There's another thing that was in the infrastructure law that isn't roads and highways, but for my dime is infrastructure.
Yeah.
But it actually helps make us more resilient eventually if on every block some people have those vehicles that can provide charging. The cyber issue is a very big one that is not just a matter of EVs, but the way that all of our transportation, certainly our cars, are headed. You know, it's notable that some of the recalls that have happened, for example, recently, usually when you think of recall, you think there's, I don't know, something wrong with the airbag or the brake pads and you got to take it in and get it fixed. A lot of recalls now are actually software recalls. The problem and the solution has to do with an over-the-air update in software.
So is this potentially a security threat, a global security or a homeland security threat? Could somebody take down our network of electric vehicles?
Probably not quite like that, but yes, this is a major issue. And as the Colonial Pipeline cyber attack reminded us, most critical infrastructure in this country is actually in local and or private hands. And so what we need to do federally is make sure we're supporting those owners and operators of infrastructure, all the way down to the owner of a vehicle, in how to make sure that they are hard targets for those kinds of cyber attacks. Because I do expect that will be an attack surface that only widens as vehicles increasingly become one and the same with technology.
Got it. Darla.
Governor Greg Abbott caused economic losses in border cities earlier this year when he ordered each truck crossing the border to be extensively searched, causing about 8-hour waits in border lines that come from Mexico to the U.S. Now, New Mexico is thinking about changing its railroad imports to New Mexico, which would cause a severe economic loss in Texas. Do you plan to do something about this?
So, obviously, I can only do so much about what a governor decides to do.
It's within his right to do this, whether you agree with it or not. The governor didn't do anything outside of his right.
Fine, but we do truck inspections and we do them very, very well.
Right.
So it raises the question, obviously, of, does adding that, again, especially from somebody who styles himself as a conservative, does adding a bureaucratic step like that actually have any material benefit, or is it just politics?
Another Abbott question. What are your thoughts on how he's using buses to transport migrants out of Texas?
You have a point of view about this is both Governor Abbott and Governor DeSantis have both been in the news this week. What do you say about that?
Well, it's not helping. And I don't mean to be flip about that. What I'm saying is, obviously, there are issues with the border and with migration. But these are the kinds of stunts you see from people who don't have a solution. Like, where have these, Governor DeSantis was in Congress. Where was he when they were debating immigration reform? What have any of these people done to be part of the solution? So, I get if you're after attention. It's one thing to call attention to a problem. When you have a course of action, as some of the folks here speaking up about an issue, exercising their First Amendment rights have done, or in elected office. It's another to just call attention to a problem because the problem is actually more useful to you than the solution, and that helps you call attention to yourself. And that's what's going on. And the problem, of course, it's one thing if that was just people being obnoxious, but human beings are being impacted by that. You flee a communist regime in Venezuela, you come here, and then somebody tricks you. Somebody using Florida taxpayer money for some reason tricks you into going from Texas to Massachusetts. It's not just ineffectual. It is hurting people in order to get attention.
Do you think, Darla, if you don't mind, I want to follow up on that. Do you think, Mr. Secretary, that the administration has anything to answer for on the border? That is, of course, the underlying allegation here is that the administration has not done what it needs to do to solve this problem. We may not like, you may not like the response.
Well, I don't think anybody thinks that we're in a great or perfect situation here, nor were we under the last administration. And part of that is because for many, many years now, there has been total obstruction of any kind of meaningful reform. But I would also say, at least speaking for my little piece of it, the transportation piece, we're funding improved inspection facilities in McAllen. We're funding improved highway capacity for Santa Teresa in New Mexico at the land port of entry. We're funding Otay Mesa in California, where they have a border facility that needs upgrades there. And you know what? We're funding it with infrastructure dollars that got a big no vote from some of the people who are making a lot of noise about these issues right now. So you can either be part of the solution or you can be part of the problem.
Okay. Got a couple more minutes, Darla. Let's take some more.
Great. Many Texas cities are notoriously unwalkable. How can we incentivize states and cities to build more walkable and accessible infrastructure?
So this is hugely important, and it's not just a lifestyle issue or a climate issue, although it's important for those reasons. It is a safety issue. One of the biggest things we're doing right now is investing through a program called Safe Streets and Roads for All, and just through our routine road and street funding, what's called complete streets. The idea that you ought to design your streets and roadways not only to push vehicle traffic through as quickly as possible, but in a way that makes sense for vehicles and bicycles and pedestrians, and for that matter, businesses on streetscapes coexisting peacefully. And that's what streets ought to look like.
Yeah.
We haven't always done that. We definitely didn't do that during the heyday of the last generation of highway construction in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. We can do it in a way that's responsible, that keeps traffic moving in a reasonable way, but doesn't force you to go 3/4 of a mile to even get to a safe crosswalk. And as we do that, we make people better off, we make economies better off, we do what transportation's supposed to do, which is connect, not just divide. And I'm really excited about what's happening in this regard, understanding the virtue of active transportation, because shame on us if we build infrastructure today that we're going to be still using in the 2050s and do it on the principles that governed our thinking back in the 1950s. Let's do it different. Let's do it better.
Take two more.
How do you keep infrastructure affordable for low-income and minority communities? For example, toll roads, expensive high-speed rails, rising
Right.
public transit prices, and airline prices.
You know, we did talk about the equity through line on the
Yeah.
public transportation part, but really there's an equity through line on all of this stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah. And if you are lower income, housing plus transportation can be 40% or more of your budget. And let me mention the relationship between housing and transportation. Right? Far too many people have ridiculously long commutes so they can live somewhere they can afford, or live somewhere they can't really afford in order to be able to get transportation into work. So we have a responsibility to get this right that goes beyond any one policy area. Mayors get this, cities get this, because they don't have the luxury of thinking about housing one year and transportation the next. The federal org chart is not really designed to think about it that way, but
Yeah.
we're doing more and more of that, partnering with HUD, funding transit-oriented development, paying attention to the economic impact of what we're doing, saving people money through better transit, biggest investment in transit in the history of the country, actually, at the federal level, giving people options. And if I could just return one more time to electric vehicles, right? We're making EVs cheaper with these tax credits, including, importantly, used EVs, as well as the new ones, so that not only can more people afford to buy them, but they can capture the fuel savings that come with the advantage
Yeah.
of having them. That's why we're not just generally saying they're nice to have. We're actively making them less expensive.
How are you ensuring that any of the projects that this money is funding are not displacing underserved communities? This is always an issue, isn't it?
That's where the public participation comes in. And we have a troubled history as a country on this, and we ought to face it. And I don't bring it up in order to make people feel bad. I bring it up because we can do something about it.
Right.
I was just in Detroit. We're going to be funding an effort to take I-375, which cleared out a neighborhood called Black Bottom and another neighborhood there, just devastated what had been a vibrant black neighborhood, and to this day sits like a gash the way it goes through that town. And we're going to Michigan, with our help, is going to bring it up to the surface, turn it into a boulevard. It's actually going to connect where it used to divide. But we also have to do it in a way that has local participation, both in design of the project and, one hopes, in the opportunity of doing the project, the businesses and the workers.
Right.
You know, historically, the building trades, great paying jobs, haven't always looked like America. You hear from a lot of people, especially in a neighborhood, low-income neighborhood, community of color, finally get the investment coming to them. They look around at the people in the hard hats working on the project. Not one of them looks like they actually came from that neighborhood. That's why we're supporting things like local hire, to make sure that everybody gets access to those benefits.
Darla, I lied. We don't have time for one more question. I apologize. Everybody give Darla Cameron a big hand. Very good to have her here. Good support. Thank you. Mr. Secretary, we're out of time. Thank you so much for kicking off our big weekend. We loved having you here.
It's an honor. Thanks for having me.
Right.
Thanks.
All right. Everybody, rest up. We have amazing things over the next 2 days. Thank you so much for coming to the festival. We'll see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
I really appreciate it. I thought it was a really good